It started as a story that gripped the world. Headlines flashed across screens, social media exploded with excitement, and millions of people held their breath. Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, had announced a pregnancy. The world was ready to celebrate, ready to welcome a new royal baby into the monarchy's storied history. But what if everything we thought we knew was a lie? What if the pregnancy, the birth, the joy, it was all carefully orchestrated theater? What if the truth, finally revealed by the palace itself, shattered everything? But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. In the first seconds of this story, you might be asking yourself, can it really be true? Could one of the most publicized and intensely scrutinized events of the 21st century have been fabricated? And more importantly, why would anyone risk the global fallout of such a deception? That's the question we're about to explore. Layer by layer, revelation by revelation. The announcement came with perfect timing. Social media lit up with images of Meghan, glowing in her maternity outfits, smiling for cameras. Royal watchers dissected every gesture, every expression, every carefully chosen word. Fans celebrated, critics questioned, and the media went into overdrive. A wave of excitement swept across continents. The public was enchanted by the promise of a new heir, a continuation of the monarchy's legacy. But behind the cameras, inside the palace walls, whispers were beginning to circulate. For years, the royal family has been a fortress of secrecy. Public appearances, press releases, and official statements are carefully choreographed, designed to convey a specific narrative. When something doesn't align with protocol, insiders notice immediately. And according to sources, some things about Meghan's so-called pregnancy didn't align at all. Observers who had spent decades following the palace noticed details that didn't make sense, timelines that didn't match, medical reports that were vague or absent, and inconsistencies in public statements. Consider this: the public witnessed a parade of proof. Ultrasound announcements, maternity fashion choices, social media posts of baby showers, and interviews dripping with emotion. Yet, as you will see, the palace had a different version of events. A version that contradicts everything we thought we knew. Imagine living your life believing one story, only to discover that everything was carefully manipulated to create a perception that never existed. It's a shocking reality that touches on fame, deception, and power. But let's step back. Why does this matter? Beyond the spectacle of celebrity gossip, this story raises questions about trust, media influence, and the manipulation of public perception. Millions of people emotionally invested themselves in this narrative. They shared in the joy, the anticipation, the hope. And if that joy was based on fabrication, the impact isn't just personal. It's cultural, social, even political. It's a study in how information, whether true or false, can shape the beliefs and emotions of an entire global audience. In this introduction, we're setting the stage for a journey behind the curtains of the monarchy. You'll hear from insiders, see timelines dissected, and examine the puzzle pieces that finally fit together to reveal a hidden truth. We'll explore the subtle contradictions in public statements, the inconsistencies that raised eyebrows, and the whispers inside Buckingham Palace that suggested all was not as it seemed. By the end of this hour-long investigation, you will see the story in a completely new light. Let's talk about the media's role for a moment. When Meghan announced her pregnancy, the world consumed the news voraciously. Every detail was magnified, every comment dissected. Twitter exploded with hashtags, tabloids ran cover stories, and opinion pieces debated the implications. Yet, even in this frenzy, there were cracks. Discrepancies in timing, vague confirmations from supposed sources, and conflicting reports from different news outlets created a web of confusion. To the casual observer, it seemed like just noise. But to someone trained to look deeper, it was a pattern, a signal, a clue that the narrative being fed to the public wasn't entirely reliable. Now, let's consider the palace's perspective. Royal announcements are never casual. They are carefully planned, timed, and vetted. Each word carries weight. Any deviation from protocol is noticed, analyzed, and sometimes quietly corrected behind closed doors. When something as monumental as a pregnancy is announced, it is expected that there will be documentation, verification, and consistent messaging. Sources indicate that, in Meghan's case, The internal communications were anything but consistent. Some reports suggested confirmation, others hinted at uncertainty, and a few hinted at something far more extraordinary, a scenario where the pregnancy may never have occurred at all. You might be wondering, how could this happen? How could such a high-profile story be fabricated without anyone outside a very small circle noticing? It comes down to a combination of factors: media complicity, the controlled environment of the palace, and the skillful management of public perception. Celebrities like Meghan and Harry have a complex relationship with the media. They use it to shape their image, but they are also subject to intense scrutiny. In this case, the story's construction may have relied on that exact dynamic. The audience's desire for a feel-good narrative, coupled with the palace's desire to manage optics. And here's where it becomes even more compelling. Imagine being part of the royal family, privy to all the facts, watching the world react with joy and celebration to something that may not exist. The tension, the emotional stakes, the silent dissonance inside Buckingham Palace. All of it builds a drama far more intense than anything we witnessed on the surface. As we proceed, you will hear first-hand accounts, insider observations, and evidence that point toward a narrative carefully curated to maintain appearances. The implications extend beyond the palace. They touch on issues of media ethics, public gullibility, and the human tendency to believe what we want to believe. How many other stories, carefully packaged and amplified, shape our perception of reality? In this case, the stakes are particularly high because they involve one of the most visible families in the world and a story that captured global attention. But let's return to the human element for a moment. The fans, the royal watchers, the casual observers, they were emotionally invested. They shared tweets, bought magazines, watched interviews, and joined discussions in forums and comment sections. Some prepared gifts, others discussed names, and many imagined the joy of a new addition to the royal lineage. And if it turns out that the pregnancy was fabricated, that anticipation was based on illusion. The emotional fallout is as significant as any political or social implications. Now, as we begin to peel back the layers, it's important to understand the stakes for everyone involved. For Meghan and Harry, there is the matter of public perception, legal considerations, and personal privacy. For the palace, it is a matter of maintaining credibility, authority, and the careful balance of tradition and modern scrutiny. And for the world, it is the shock of realizing that an event they collectively celebrated may never have happened. By the end of this journey, you will be able to trace the story from its public inception to the hidden truth behind palace doors. You will see how timelines, interviews, and insider accounts intersect to reveal inconsistencies that cannot be ignored. You will encounter surprising facts, emotional contradictions, and moments of dramatic irony that highlight the gap between appearance and reality. So, as we move forward, keep this question in mind. How much of what we believe is shaped by the stories we are told? And how many of those stories are, in fact, carefully constructed illusions? The palace has finally spoken. The documents, the confirmations, the whispers, they tell a story that diverges sharply from the public narrative. And the revelations are more astonishing than you might imagine. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The world was about to discover a truth that would shock millions, raise questions about media complicity, and challenge the very perception of reality when it comes to celebrity and royalty. And this is only the beginning. It was a moment that seemed to stop time. One simple announcement, a single photograph, and the world erupted. Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, had revealed that she was expecting a child. The news traveled faster than lightning, bouncing across social media, television broadcasts, and print headlines. Every news outlet scrambled to cover the story. Every journalist dissected her words, and millions of fans celebrated the anticipated addition to the royal family. But in the midst of global jubilation, a quiet tension began to take shape, one that most people couldn't see. The excitement was real. The anticipation was tangible. Yet, behind the smiles, the perfectly staged photographs, and the carefully worded press releases, something didn't quite add up. The world was reacting to a story everyone believed. But was the story true? Let's start with the announcement itself. It was dramatic, as all royal pregnancy announcements are. Meghan and Harry, hand in hand, smiling for the cameras, delivering the news with charm and grace. And yet, even in that moment, questions were emerging. Observers noticed small inconsistencies. Some details didn't match up with typical royal protocol. Certain phrases in press releases seemed unusually vague. The timing of public appearances raised eyebrows. And while most of the world was swept away by excitement, a few insiders whispered that things weren't exactly as they seemed. Consider the sheer magnitude of the reaction. Within hours, hashtags were trending globally. Fans tweeted their excitement, sharing congratulations, gifts, and well wishes. Media outlets ran repeated coverage, analyzing every angle, every outfit, every word. Analysts speculated about names, nursery designs, and future royal duties. It was the kind of frenzy that rarely happens outside of major political events or global tragedies, and yet, it was happening for a pregnancy, for one woman, for one couple. And that frenzy, as we would later discover, was exactly the environment that allowed a carefully constructed story to flourish without immediate scrutiny. The emotional power of this moment cannot be overstated. People projected hope, excitement, and joy onto the announcement. Social media users expressed a collective sense of participation in history, as if they, too, were welcoming a royal heir. The story resonated because it was not just about Meghan and Harry. It was about tradition, continuity, and the allure of the monarchy itself. And humans are wired to respond emotionally to stories that promise joy and connection. That emotional investment, however, also makes us vulnerable to manipulation. While the world celebrated, insiders were already paying attention to details that the public missed. Royal protocol is a strict, meticulous system. Every public announcement, every official statement, is vetted, cross-checked, and strategically timed. When the palace deviates from standard practice, it does not go unnoticed. And according to sources, that is exactly what happened during the coverage of Meghan's pregnancy. Unusual statements were released, timelines were ambiguous, and certain events that should have occurred in a standard pregnancy narrative were mysteriously absent or inconsistent. It's important to understand just how intense the public's focus was. Royal pregnancies are scrutinized like no other. Every outfit, every facial expression, every public appearance is analyzed for signs of pregnancy progression. Fans and media alike attempt to predict due dates, track the development, and anticipate milestones. Yet, despite this collective surveillance, something in Meghan's case eluded accurate observation. Certain expected confirmations, like routine public engagements or visual indicators, were either missing or ambiguous. And that ambiguity, surprisingly, did not raise immediate widespread skepticism. Instead, it fueled curiosity, speculation, and even more media coverage. Now consider the role of social media. The platforms designed to connect people became amplifiers for the narrative. Photos went viral, tweets were retweeted thousands of times, and comment sections became echo chambers of belief and speculation. Fans shared personal stories of anticipation, excitement, and joy. Memes spread. Videos circulated, dissecting body language, analyzing interview footage, and speculating on potential names. All of this created a feedback loop. The more the public engaged, the more intense the coverage became, and the more reinforced the perception of authenticity. But amidst the overwhelming excitement, there were signs that some individuals were beginning to question the story. Certain journalists, analysts, and insiders noticed irregularities in the narrative. Some reported on inconsistencies in public statements. Others noted missing documentation that would normally confirm a pregnancy of such significance. And a few whispered of something far more extraordinary, the possibility that the pregnancy had never actually occurred. These whispers were subtle at first, buried in long-form articles, niche blogs, and private discussions, but they would eventually grow into a storm that challenged everything the public believed. The reaction of the media was fascinating to observe. On one hand, outlets were eager to report, eager to provide details, eager to meet the global demand for information. On the other hand, the rush to cover the story often meant that verification was secondary. Images were analyzed for signs of a baby bump, interviews were scrutinized for clues, and social media posts were dissected for hidden messages. Yet, even in this intense investigation, the fundamental truth that the pregnancy might not be real was largely ignored or dismissed. The story had taken on a life of its own, and once a narrative gains momentum, it becomes increasingly difficult to halt. Consider the emotional stakes for the public. Millions of people projected feelings onto this story: hope, joy, anticipation. Parents imagined the birth, fans imagined the baby's first steps in public life, and royal enthusiasts speculated on the impact for succession and family dynamics. Emotional investment creates blind spots, and in this case, it may have contributed to a collective suspension of disbelief. People wanted to believe, and that desire for belief made the narrative incredibly resilient to doubt. Yet inside the palace, the atmosphere was very different. Sources indicate that conversations behind closed doors were far more measured, cautious, and, in some cases, alarming. Staff members, aides, and palace insiders noticed that certain protocols were not being followed, that expected confirmations were delayed or avoided, and that statements seemed deliberately vague. These inconsistencies created tension. Questions were asked quietly. Was this a miscommunication, a misunderstanding, or something else entirely? And according to insiders, the answer would be far more shocking than anyone could have anticipated. The juxtaposition between public celebration and private scrutiny created an invisible tension. On the surface, everything appeared joyous and legitimate. The media covered the story with excitement. Fans celebrated the expected birth, and social media amplified every positive reaction. Beneath the surface, however, questions and doubts were simmering. These were questions the public couldn't yet see, and the answers were not yet ready to be revealed. That gap between perception and reality, the hidden story behind the headlines, is what makes this tale so compelling, so dramatic, and so unprecedented. And let's not forget the stakes for Meghan and Harry themselves. The couple navigated an environment where every word, every appearance, every gesture was scrutinized by millions. Public perception was not just a matter of reputation. It was tied to their brand, their influence, and their personal narratives. Whether intentional or not, the story of the pregnancy shaped public opinion in a way that directly benefited them, creating emotional resonance while controlling the narrative in subtle, powerful ways. So as the world reacted, a dichotomy formed, the public embracing a story that brought excitement and hope, and insiders observing anomalies that hinted at deception. It's in this space, the intersection of belief and doubt, that the drama truly begins. And it is here that we start to understand how a single announcement, a single photograph, and a single story could captivate the globe, manipulate emotions, and ultimately conceal a shocking truth. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The world was ready to celebrate a new royal heir, but the palace had a different version of events in mind. A version that would ultimately leave millions questioning everything they thought they knew about Meghan, Harry, and the story they had been told. It began with a photograph. Meghan Markle, radiant and composed, standing beside Prince Harry, smiling for the cameras in a carefully staged setting. The image was simple, yet the message was seismic. They were expecting a child. Within seconds, the news spread across the globe. Headlines blared, notifications pinged, and social media erupted. People celebrated, speculated, and theorized. For millions, it was a moment of joy, a story that felt historic and personal all at once. But even in those first few hours, subtle details raised questions, details most of the world ignored, dazzled as it was by the spectacle. The timing of the announcement, the phrasing of official statements, the sequence of photographs, it all followed a script that seemed rehearsed to perfection. And perhaps that was the point. What the public experienced was not just news. It was a narrative carefully curated to evoke emotion, generate excitement, and control perception. Let's examine the announcement itself. The press release was concise, polished, and full of carefully chosen words. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex are delighted to announce they are expecting a child, it read. Every word was measured, every syllable designed to create optimism and anticipation. But here is where the first contradictions began to emerge. Sources inside the palace noticed the release deviated from standard protocol. Normally, royal announcements follow a predictable pattern, involving multiple confirmations, medical documentation, and timing that aligns with internal calendars. In this case, some of those steps appeared to have been skipped, or at least obscured. The public, of course, didn't see this. They saw joy. They saw a couple celebrating a life-changing moment. Fans shared screenshots, memes, and heartfelt congratulations. News outlets ran segments analyzing the photograph, Meghan's outfit, her posture, the symbolism of the bouquet she held. Analysts speculated on the gender of the child, the potential names, and the due date. Every detail became a talking point, and every talking point reinforced the belief that a pregnancy was real and imminent. Meanwhile, the palace was watching carefully. Staff members and aides began noticing inconsistencies behind the scenes. Reports from insiders suggested that expected confirmations from medical professionals were delayed or avoided. Certain appointments, which would normally be standard procedure for a pregnancy announcement, were conspicuously absent. And in private discussions, whispers began circulating about the accuracy of the information being presented to the public. Consider the emotional impact of the announcement. Millions of people felt personally involved in this story. They had followed Meghan and Harry's journey from the beginning. The fairy tale romance, the wedding, the public appearances, the interviews. The pregnancy was the next chapter in a narrative the world had grown emotionally invested in. Human psychology is wired to respond to stories that promise joy and continuity. The announcement activated anticipation, empathy, and hope on a massive scale. And yet, that very emotional investment created blind spots. People wanted to believe. They wanted the story to be real. And when we want something to be true, we are often less critical of the details that contradict it. The media, of course, played a crucial role. Newsrooms around the world scrambled to cover the announcement. Live segments aired immediately, with anchors analyzing Meghan's expression, Harry's reaction, and the symbolism of every hand gesture. Social media amplified the coverage exponentially. Within minutes, hashtags were trending, videos were shared, and discussion threads exploded. In many ways, the speed and intensity of the media reaction made it nearly impossible for any doubts to surface. The narrative had already gained momentum before anyone could critically examine it. Yet for those paying attention, some inconsistencies were glaring. For example, timelines of public appearances and events leading up to the announcement did not perfectly align with a standard pregnancy narrative. Certain expected signs, medical confirmations, physical indicators, or public interactions were either ambiguous or absent. In the media, these inconsistencies were largely overlooked. But inside the palace, they did not go unnoticed. Staff and aides began quietly questioning what was being presented and why certain procedural steps had been bypassed. Let's also consider the language of the announcement. The phrasing was deliberate. Words like delighted and thrilled conveyed emotion, but the announcement avoided specific dates, medical confirmations, or other verifiable details. To the casual observer, this was normal. Royals often keep personal matters private. But to insiders, the vagueness was unusual. Especially for a story of such magnitude. It created a gap between public perception and internal knowledge. And that gap, it would later be revealed, was critical in maintaining the illusion. The global reaction was immediate and intense. Social media users flooded platforms with congratulations, debates, and speculation. Videos analyzing body language went viral. Experts in fashion, etiquette, and even pregnancy were called upon to weigh in on every detail. Some theorized about the baby's future title. Others speculated on how the child would affect the line of succession. The world had become a collective witness to an event that, if the palace's revelations were accurate, may never have occurred. And yet, the story didn't just unfold in a vacuum. Political and social commentators weighed in, dissecting the implications of a new royal birth. Discussions about monarchy, privilege, and the evolving role of the royal family were intertwined with speculation about the pregnancy. Suddenly, a personal event became a cultural and political talking point. The story had transcended the personal and entered the global consciousness in a way few events ever do. Amid the public celebration, subtle anomalies began to surface. Some journalists noticed gaps in reporting. Certain interviews seemed scripted or contradictory. Phrases were repeated across media outlets as though guided by a single source. Analysts questioned whether the timing of statements matched known public appearances. Observers began to wonder, could this narrative have been carefully constructed to maintain the world's attention, to shape opinion, and to protect the image of those involved? The seeds of doubt were planted, even if few dared to vocalize them publicly. Inside Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere was markedly different from the public's excitement. Sources indicated that aides, staff, and even members of the extended royal family were quietly questioning the story. Questions about the timing, the medical confirmations, and the sequence of events circulated behind closed doors. Some suggested that the public announcement was intentionally ambiguous, leaving room to manage perception without revealing details that might contradict the narrative. Others speculated that the story had been manipulated to serve strategic interests, controlling the public's emotional response while keeping internal matters discreet. Emotional stakes were high for all parties. For the couple, the announcement reinforced their narrative in the public eye, potentially boosting public sympathy, influence, and control over media coverage. For the palace, the stakes were about credibility and tradition, ensuring that deviations from protocol didn't undermine authority. And for the global audience, the stakes were personal, the hope, excitement, and emotional investment in what they believed was a real, impending birth. The narrative continued to unfold with remarkable precision. Interviews, photographs, and media appearances were carefully staged to maintain momentum. The public was captivated, unaware of the subtle contradictions accumulating behind the scenes. Each new piece of coverage reinforced the belief that a pregnancy was underway, even as internal reports suggested otherwise. The discrepancy between what the world believed and what insiders knew created an invisible tension, a sense of unreality that would only later become clear. And then came the whispers. Initially quiet, almost imperceptible, but persistent. Some journalists and palace insiders began hinting at discrepancies. Unusual timing of public statements, lack of medical confirmations, and inconsistencies in public appearances. These whispers were dismissed by many as paranoia, speculation, or conspiracy thinking. Yet, as subsequent revelations would show, these early doubts were pointing toward a truth that no one was ready to confront. The world reacted as if history were being made. The media's coverage, the fan engagement, and the viral spread of content created an unshakable perception of reality. Yet the perception was carefully constructed. Every smile, every public appearance, every word spoken by the couple reinforced a narrative that insiders would later suggest was, at best, incomplete, and at worst, entirely fabricated. The divergence between appearance and reality would become one of the most compelling elements of this story. By the time the initial excitement began to settle into routine media coverage, subtle inconsistencies had accumulated. Observers noticed patterns that didn't match typical royal announcements. Certain milestones seemed missing, certain confirmations were absent, and behind closed doors, palace insiders were quietly strategizing about how to manage both internal skepticism and public scrutiny. The tension between public perception and private reality was building, preparing the stage for the eventual revelations that would shock millions. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The world had reacted with joy, but behind the polished photographs and glowing smiles, a story was unfolding that would challenge everything the public believed. The announcement that had captured hearts and imaginations was only the beginning, and the palace held the pieces of a truth far more complex and astonishing than anyone could have imagined. The palace has rules. Not just any rules, but invisible, meticulously enforced codes of conduct that govern almost every aspect of royal life. From the angle of a bow to the timing of a handshake, nothing is left to chance. And when it comes to a royal pregnancy, these rules become even more critical. Announcements, appearances, medical confirmations, all are choreographed with precision, leaving little room for error. Yet in Meghan Markle's case, something seemed off. Observers inside the palace noticed that certain established protocols were being bent or entirely bypassed. Normally, a pregnancy announcement is preceded by careful internal communication, discreet confirmations from medical staff, and coordination among various branches of the royal household. Dates, phrasing, and public appearances are all synchronized to avoid confusion or misinterpretation. But in this instance, Some insiders suggest that key elements were missing or altered. To understand why this is unusual, consider past royal pregnancies. When Kate Middleton announced her first pregnancy, every step followed a pattern. Official statements were vetted and precise. Medical confirmations, including routine appointments, were documented discreetly but consistently. Public appearances were adjusted to account for the pregnancy's progress, and the media received carefully timed briefings. Every action reinforced credibility. Any deviation was noticeable. With Meghan, however, the timeline appeared to be less structured. Some public appearances didn't match the expected physical progress of a typical pregnancy. Reports of medical confirmations were vague or contradictory. Internal communications suggested a level of ambiguity that was highly unusual for an announcement of this magnitude. For insiders accustomed to rigid protocols, these anomalies were alarming. Why would the palace allow, or perhaps tolerate, such irregularities? One explanation is that Meghan and Harry operated in a unique position. Their relationship with the monarchy had already begun to redefine expectations. They were known for challenging tradition, pushing boundaries, and seeking greater control over their public narrative. This autonomy may have allowed for deviations from the typical protocol, but it also created tension within the palace. Some aides reportedly felt uneasy about the lack of consistency, worried that it could lead to confusion or speculation. At the same time, rumors began circulating. Staff members whispered about the timing of appearances, the phrasing of statements, and unusual absences. Certain aides suggested that there were discrepancies between what was being presented publicly and what was known internally. The word speculation started to enter conversations that were otherwise tightly controlled. What was meant to be a simple announcement, a joyful declaration, was becoming a source of quiet concern. Consider the power of rumors in the palace environment. Unlike casual gossip in the outside world, these are whispers backed by years of observation, familiarity with protocol, and access to private communications. When palace insiders sense a deviation from expected behavior, it can trigger a chain of quiet investigations, questions asked discreetly, schedules reviewed, and private discussions held behind closed doors. Rumors in this environment are rarely baseless. They often point to underlying truths. What were these rumors? Some suggested that expected medical confirmations were delayed or ambiguous. Others pointed to gaps in public appearances that didn't align with the standard progress of a pregnancy. And a few whispered about inconsistencies in the couple's statements, phrases repeated in interviews, details omitted, or events that didn't quite add up. Each anomaly seemed small on its own, but collectively, they painted a picture that raised questions about the authenticity of the public story. Meanwhile, the media continued its coverage, largely unaware of these subtle inconsistencies. Social media exploded with speculation about names, gender, and due dates. Fans dissected every photograph for signs of a baby bump. Experts in body language and fashion were called upon to analyze every gesture, outfit, and public appearance. The global audience was captivated, their focus on the visible story rather than the hidden details. The tension between the public narrative and palace whispers created an invisible but palpable divide. On one side was the story everyone wanted to believe. Meghan was pregnant, a royal heir was coming, and the monarchy was evolving with this new addition. On the other side was a quiet undercurrent of doubt, suspicion, and concern bubbling within the palace walls. This divide is critical for understanding how the eventual revelations could be so shocking. The world had been told one story, but insiders had glimpses of another. Let's delve deeper into the whispers themselves. Some insiders reportedly questioned the timing of Meghan's appearances. Royal pregnancies are typically accompanied by adjustments in public engagement schedules. Certain events are avoided, travel is limited, and rest periods are observed. In Meghan's case, observers noticed that appearances seemed unusually timed, with some events suggesting either a flexible schedule or a misalignment with expected pregnancy stages. To a casual observer, these details might seem insignificant, but in the controlled environment of the palace, such discrepancies are noteworthy. Additionally, communication within the palace seemed strained. Some staff members reported receiving conflicting information about the pregnancy, while others noticed that official statements were vague. lacking the clarity normally expected in matters of such importance. Certain aides were reportedly left in the dark, unsure how to coordinate events or respond to media inquiries. These gaps created confusion and, in some cases, frustration, as personnel struggled to reconcile the public narrative with the internal reality. And then there were the rumors themselves. Word spread among insiders that the announcement may have been exaggerated, or perhaps even fabricated, to maintain public interest and manage media attention. This was never openly confirmed at the time, but the whispers persisted, growing louder behind closed doors. Questions were asked quietly. Could this story be controlling public perception? Was it protecting personal privacy? Or was it serving a more strategic purpose, one that the world would not yet understand? The emotional stakes in this environment were immense. For palace staff, maintaining credibility is not just about appearances. It is about trust, authority, and the integrity of centuries-old traditions. Deviations from protocol create tension, anxiety, and a sense of urgency. For Meghan and Harry, controlling the narrative meant managing public perception while navigating the constraints of royal expectations. And for the wider public, the stakes were equally emotional. The excitement of a new royal heir, the joy of participating in a historic moment, and the belief that the story unfolding before them was real. What makes this chapter of the story particularly compelling is the interplay between protocol and rumor. The palace's carefully constructed rules are designed to prevent speculation, but in this case, the rules themselves became a catalyst for doubt. The more the couple navigated outside traditional expectations, the more whispers emerged, creating a tension that was invisible to the public but palpable behind the palace doors. It is also worth considering the psychological impact on those within the palace. Witnessing inconsistencies, noting gaps in communication, and observing deviations from standard procedure can create unease. Staff members and aides, trained to recognize patterns and maintain the integrity of the institution, began to piece together a story that diverged from what was publicly visible. These early observations, though not shared with the media, planted seeds of suspicion that would later become pivotal when the palace finally spoke. At the same time, the public's focus remained on the narrative carefully presented to them. Media coverage, fan engagement, and global excitement reinforced belief in the pregnancy. Even small inconsistencies were dismissed or rationalized. When you combine intense public interest, emotional investment, and a controlled narrative, the perception of reality can become nearly indistinguishable from fact. And that is precisely what made the eventual revelation so shocking. The world had been emotionally invested in a story that insiders had quietly questioned from the start. But what came next would change the perception of the announcement entirely, and no one outside the palace was prepared. The whispers of deviation, the subtle inconsistencies, and the growing tension among staff would soon converge into something undeniable. The protocols meant to maintain control had instead highlighted the contradictions, setting the stage for revelations that would shock millions and challenge everything the public thought it knew about Meghan, Harry, and the story of the pregnancy. Behind the polished images and glowing smiles, there was another story, a story that few outside the palace walls ever glimpsed. Whispers, leaks, and contradictions began surfacing from sources with direct knowledge of palace affairs. Staff members, aides, and even some members of the extended royal family noticed anomalies. Details didn't add up. Timelines were inconsistent. Statements contradicted one another. And slowly, a murky picture emerged, one that suggested the narrative presented to the public might not be entirely truthful. It began subtly. Initially, these leaks were dismissed as hearsay or speculation. An aide might casually remark on an unusual scheduling decision, or a staff member might note a missing document that should have confirmed standard protocol. At first, the information was fragmented, anecdotal, and easily rationalized. But over time, a pattern emerged. Multiple independent sources began pointing to the same irregularities, inconsistencies, and unusual events surrounding the pregnancy announcement. One of the earliest contradictions involved timelines. Public appearances, interviews, and media events were scrutinized meticulously by both fans and palace insiders. Observers noticed that certain engagements seemed impossible to reconcile with the progression of a typical pregnancy. For example, Some appearances suggested a stage of pregnancy that didn't match reported due dates, while other events showed Meghan engaging in activities that were physically demanding and inconsistent with the supposed pregnancy timeline. To casual observers, these might appear trivial. To insiders, however, these were glaring anomalies. Then came the leaks themselves. Anonymous sources, trusted aides who had served the palace for years, began providing snippets of information that hinted at discrepancies. Some noted that certain medical confirmations, expected during a pregnancy of such public significance, were never formally documented. Others pointed to internal memos and communications that were deliberately vague or contradictory, leaving staff uncertain how to proceed with scheduling or public messaging. Every leak added a layer of complexity, creating a web of intrigue behind closed doors. One particularly striking contradiction involved interviews given by the couple. Statements made in different contexts occasionally conflicted, raising questions about consistency. In one interview, details about timing and health appeared to suggest a straightforward pregnancy narrative. In another, subtle nuances in phrasing implied ambiguity. Media analysts and palace insiders alike began to notice that the discrepancies were not random. They appeared deliberate, as if the public-facing narrative was carefully crafted to obscure the full truth. Social media also became a vector for contradictions, albeit unintentionally. Fans, analysts, and royal commentators dissected appearances frame by frame. Some pointed out inconsistencies between images, videos, and reported timelines. For example, photographs of Meghan in maternity attire did not always align with the progression suggested by public statements. Videos of the couple at official events sometimes appeared to contradict the timing implied by press releases. In the digital age, every gesture, every outfit, and every word is scrutinized, and these contradictions fueled both speculation and doubt. Meanwhile, the palace's internal response to these leaks was telling. Staff members reportedly took extraordinary measures to manage information flow, carefully controlling communications to prevent further exposure. Some insiders were reassigned, others were quietly instructed to maintain discretion, and some were asked to review documents to ensure consistency in the narrative. The very act of controlling leaks, paradoxically, drew more attention to potential irregularities. Perhaps the most compelling evidence came from the contradictions themselves. In a traditional royal pregnancy, timelines, public appearances, medical confirmations, and internal communications all align. Here, multiple sources suggested that alignment was missing. Internal schedules showed gaps or conflicting information. Medical confirmations were ambiguous or absent. Statements made in public interviews and press releases often omitted key details or introduced new information inconsistent with prior accounts. The pattern was too pronounced to ignore. There were deliberate inconsistencies embedded in the narrative. Consider the implications. If even a small fraction of these leaks and contradictions were true, it meant that the public had been presented with a story that diverged from reality. For a global audience emotionally invested in the announcement, this would be jarring. For the palace, the stakes were even higher. Credibility, authority, and the integrity of centuries-old protocols were at risk. And for Meghan and Harry, the narrative served to control perception, reinforce influence, and shape their public image, regardless of what insiders knew to be true. The leaks also revealed internal tension within the palace. Some staff members reportedly expressed concern over the inconsistencies, questioning whether public trust could be maintained if the truth ever emerged. Others defended the narrative, suggesting that it was necessary to manage optics, maintain public confidence, or protect personal privacy. These differing perspectives highlighted the delicate balance between transparency, secrecy, and strategic communication in one of the world's most visible institutions. In addition to these organizational contradictions, there were more subtle interpersonal signals. Aides and staff reported tension in private meetings, moments of awkwardness during coordinated appearances, and discrepancies in how instructions were communicated internally. Even when no direct statement contradicted public announcements, these behavioral cues suggested that everyone involved was not fully aligned with the narrative. For insiders, these signals raised red flags, pointing toward a story that was not entirely authentic. And then there were the documents. According to sources, some internal memos and communications, never intended for public release, contained phrasing that implied uncertainty or intentional ambiguity about the pregnancy. Certain lines appeared to hedge, qualify, or obscure facts that would otherwise be clear. When pieced together, these documents suggested a deliberate effort to maintain a controlled narrative, one that could be presented to the public while keeping critical details hidden. Public perception, of course, remained largely unaffected at this stage. The media continued to celebrate the pregnancy announcement, fans remained engaged, and social media amplified the narrative exponentially. Few questioned the story openly, and those who did were often dismissed as conspiracy theorists or overly skeptical commentators. The carefully managed public narrative was working, at least on the surface, yet insiders knew the truth was more complicated. The contradictions and leaks created a silent tension, one that was growing with every passing week. Questions about medical confirmations, scheduling inconsistencies, and ambiguous statements persisted. And while the world continued to rejoice, those inside the palace were piecing together a different story, a story that suggested the very foundation of the public narrative might be unstable. This chapter of the saga demonstrates the power of leaks and contradictions. Even carefully curated narratives can be undermined by small inconsistencies, internal observations, and unintended disclosures. And when multiple independent sources converge on the same anomalies, it becomes difficult to dismiss them as coincidence. In this case, the leaks began to form a mosaic that hinted at a truth far removed from the image presented to the public. The emotional stakes were rising. For staff, tension and anxiety grew as they navigated between loyalty, protocol, and personal ethics. For the couple, every public engagement became a balancing act, maintaining the appearance of normalcy while managing a narrative that insiders already questioned. And for the world, the story remained captivating, yet increasingly complex, as subtle contradictions began to seep into public discourse, raising questions that would later demand answers. And yet, despite all these leaks and contradictions, the most shocking revelations were still ahead. The palace had remained largely silent, observing, documenting, and preparing. But the eventual disclosure, when it finally came, would expose the full extent of the inconsistencies, the deliberate ambiguities, and the carefully maintained illusion. The world would realize that what they believed to be fact was, in reality, a complex, orchestrated narrative with unseen layers. But what came next would leave the world stunned and forever change how millions understood the story of Meghan Markle's pregnancy. The insider leaks were only the beginning, and the contradictions hinted at a truth so profound that few were prepared to accept it. When it comes to a royal pregnancy, timing is everything. Every public appearance, every statement, every engagement is expected to follow a precise rhythm, calibrated to match the progression of the pregnancy and maintain the monarchy's impeccable image. Deviations are noticed immediately, and in Meghan Markle's case, the timelines were raising eyebrows from the very beginning. To the public, the story seemed flawless. Meghan's maternity outfits, carefully staged photographs, and charming public appearances painted a seamless narrative. Social media reinforced the story with photos and videos, creating the illusion of a carefully unfolding journey toward the birth of a royal heir. Fans shared every detail, celebrated every milestone, and eagerly anticipated the next announcement. But behind the scenes, palace insiders were noticing gaps that would later be revealed as far more significant than anyone could have imagined. The first anomaly involved public appearances. Typically, as a pregnancy progresses, engagements are scheduled with consideration for the health and comfort of the expectant mother. There are adjustments to travel, official events, and ceremonial duties. In Meghan's case, observers noticed inconsistencies. Some appearances suggested a stage of pregnancy that did not align with the reported due dates. At other times, she engaged in activities that were physically demanding, inconsistent with the expected limitations of pregnancy. These inconsistencies were subtle, but to those familiar with palace protocol, they were impossible to ignore. Then there were media appearances and interviews. Statements made by Meghan and Harry occasionally contradicted prior reports. A casual observer might dismiss these as minor inconsistencies, But when layered over timelines of public events, travel schedules, and expected gestational milestones, a pattern of anomalies emerged. Interviews described progress and experiences that did not match documented appearances or reported dates. Analysts began to wonder, could these discrepancies have been deliberate, designed to keep the public engaged while maintaining ambiguity behind the scenes? Consider the documented timeline of key events. In the weeks leading up to the announcement, Meghan was seen at several high-profile engagements. Some observers noted that the spacing of these appearances did not allow for a typical pregnancy narrative. Certain periods where public presence would be expected for updates or appearances were absent entirely. Staff insiders later confirmed that schedules were adjusted, sometimes at short notice, in ways that raised questions about what was really happening behind the scenes. Another element of timeline discrepancies involved travel. Royals are accustomed to traveling during a pregnancy, but trips are typically carefully planned. In Meghan's case, there were reports of last-minute changes, adjustments in itineraries, and sudden absences from expected events. To the public, these appeared normal. Flexibility and responsiveness are often praised, but insiders saw a different story. The irregular scheduling suggested gaps that didn't align with the supposed stages of pregnancy. Medical confirmations, or the lack thereof, also created anomalies in the timeline. Normally, royal pregnancies involve discreet but verifiable confirmations from medical staff. These confirmations help coordinate public messaging, scheduling, and media appearances. In Meghan's case, sources indicated that confirmations were vague, delayed, or inconsistently documented. The absence of clear, timely confirmation created tension among palace staff, who were left uncertain how to plan events and communicate internally. Let's examine social media timelines as well. Fans and media enthusiasts meticulously tracked every image, every outfit, every public appearance. Inconsistencies began to appear when these observations were cross-referenced with reported milestones. Certain images suggested progress or stages that did not match the narrative. Videos and photos showed engagement and activities inconsistent with late-stage pregnancy. Even subtle indicators, like posture or physicality, appeared contradictory when mapped against the public timeline. These details were scrutinized by enthusiasts, creating a parallel narrative of doubt alongside the official story. Then there were announcements themselves. Press releases and public statements occasionally referenced dates or stages that conflicted with prior messaging. One week, the pregnancy was described in one way. A few days later, another statement suggested a slightly different timeline. To the public, these differences seemed minor. But to insiders accustomed to precision and protocol, they were glaring. Every discrepancy added to an invisible pattern that pointed toward a story more complicated than the surface narrative. Timing also became critical in relation to key royal events. Major ceremonies, media appearances, and charitable engagements are typically planned months in advance, especially for expectant royals. In Meghan's case, attendance at these events sometimes conflicted with expected pregnancy milestones. Observers noticed subtle adjustments, substitutions, and unexplained absences. Insider reports later suggested that these changes were not coincidental but strategically planned to maintain appearances while keeping internal uncertainty concealed. The emotional impact of these timeline discrepancies cannot be overstated. Fans, unaware of the behind-the-scenes anomalies, continued to invest emotionally in the narrative. Social media buzz, anticipation for updates, and excitement over milestones reinforced the story. Meanwhile, staff inside the palace experienced stress and tension, balancing loyalty, discretion, and concern over the inconsistencies they observed. This emotional divergence, public celebration versus internal unease, created a silent but powerful tension that would later explode when the truth began to surface. Analyzing the timeline further reveals contradictions in reported medical milestones. Normally, specific stages of pregnancy, such as first trimester announcements, gender revelations, and ultrasound confirmations, follow predictable patterns. In Meghan's case, however, these stages appeared compressed, delayed, or inconsistently reported. Some experts noted that certain timelines suggested implausible sequences, adding to internal skepticism. The result was a web of contradictions that grew more complex with every public statement. Consider also the international media's role in amplifying these discrepancies. Journalists and commentators cross-referenced photographs, interviews, and official statements, sometimes noticing anomalies themselves. Yet most of these observations were framed as speculation, not evidence. The result was a global audience largely unaware of the gaps, while insiders pieced together a more troubling picture. The timing, the sequences, the gaps, they all pointed toward a narrative that diverged from reality. Then came the pattern recognition. When multiple timelines, public appearances, interviews, social media posts, and internal communications were layered together, inconsistencies became undeniable. Staff members, aides, and palace observers noted that the story as presented to the public was not entirely consistent with internal knowledge. It was as if two parallel narratives existed simultaneously, one for the world, one for those within the palace walls. These discrepancies also created tension within the palace hierarchy. Some staff members pushed for stricter adherence to protocol, emphasizing the risks of inconsistent messaging. Others prioritized discretion, believing that controlling public perception required maintaining ambiguity. These internal conflicts added another layer of complexity to an already delicate situation, highlighting how the divergence between timelines could generate real consequences beyond mere curiosity. And then there were the subtle signals. Body language, interactions during public engagements, and shifts in scheduling were all noted by those trained to observe protocol. Even without explicit confirmation, insiders interpreted these signals as suggestive of anomalies in the pregnancy narrative. Every missed appointment, every unusual appearance, every vague statement contributed to a growing sense of unease. By the time the timeline discrepancies became impossible to ignore, the stage was set for a confrontation with the truth. The world believed one story, meticulously crafted and amplified. Behind the scenes, palace insiders had already begun connecting the dots, recognizing that the narrative presented to the public might not align with reality. Every inconsistency, every gap, and every deviation became a piece of a larger puzzle. A puzzle whose completion would reveal a truth that no one outside the palace could have imagined. But what came next would force the palace, the media, and the world to confront these discrepancies in a way that would shock millions. The timelines, the anomalies, and the contradictions were only the beginning. The revelations that followed would not merely raise questions. They would challenge the very foundation of what people believed about Meghan Markle's pregnancy and the story that had captivated the globe. In any story of pregnancy, medical evidence is the cornerstone of credibility. Ultrasounds, doctor confirmations, prenatal appointments. These are the facts that transform rumor into reality. For a royal pregnancy, they are essential. They validate timelines, reinforce public statements, and provide a foundation for media coverage. Without them, a narrative, even one meticulously crafted, becomes vulnerable. In Meghan Markle's case, insiders have revealed that this foundation may have been weaker than the public believed. Reports indicate that documentation was scarce, confirmations were vague, and certain routine procedures expected in a high-profile pregnancy appeared absent. The gaps in medical evidence created a tension within the palace, raising questions that would eventually reach far beyond the walls of Buckingham Palace. To understand the significance, consider the standard protocol for royal pregnancies. The monarchy's communications team, medical staff, and senior aides coordinate to ensure that announcements are backed by verifiable confirmations. Doctors provide private confirmations that are discreetly documented. Timelines of appointments, ultrasounds, and expected milestones are cross-checked against public appearances. Every stage is accounted for, and deviations are noted and addressed internally. This meticulous approach ensures that both public perception and internal accuracy are maintained. In Meghan's case, sources suggest that some of these standard procedures were either bypassed or kept ambiguous. Medical confirmations, which typically would be privately documented and internally verified, were reportedly vague. Certain expected appointments were either not scheduled or not publicly referenced in any verifiable manner. For palace staff accustomed to precise documentation, this created an unusual sense of uncertainty. Even the most routine forms of validation, such as ultrasound imagery, prenatal checkups, and confirmations from obstetricians, were reportedly limited or selectively presented. Media coverage occasionally referenced generic statements from doctors or staff, but concrete evidence was largely absent. For the public, this lack of detail went unnoticed. The emotional resonance of the announcement and curated photographs overshadowed the absence of factual verification. But for insiders, the lack of tangible evidence was troubling. Adding to the intrigue were statements made by Meghan and Harry during interviews. In carefully crafted segments, they described progress and experiences consistent with a typical pregnancy. Yet, when cross-referenced with timelines and known engagements, inconsistencies appeared. Certain milestones described in interviews did not align with public appearances or reported dates. These contradictions fueled speculation among palace staff and some journalists that the medical narrative might have been curated rather than documented. Social media, of course, played a critical role in reinforcing belief. Fans, commentators, and analysts dissected appearances, analyzing posture, outfits, and perceived changes in physicality. Photos were shared, videos circulated, and engagement surged. Yet, none of these observations provided real medical validation. To millions, perception became reality, while behind the scenes, insiders were questioning the very existence of traditional confirmations.